not sure I actually knew what I was going into. I mean, sitting in Scandinavia, sitting in Sweden, sitting in Europe, and making investments in Himalaya, that's a challenge. You need bridges, you need collaborations, you need people on the ground. So how do you actually do that? What is the challenges we've been facing? And how do you secure that you, from Scandinavia, raising money from Europe, secure that you can support a resilient, value-driven growth in this region? How do you secure at the same time that you can provide stable, solid returns to your investors in Europe and in North America? And these are the challenges we've been working with over the last year, and these are the challenges which we are still working on and are slowly getting in goal with. It has been very enriching, it's very insightful. It's a process where we're learning a lot from this region, and it's also a challenge which I find extremely fascinating. So challenges have been mentioned a number of times today, and it's mentioned all over again. I'm seen in my bank, which is only 16,000 people, I'm seen as a little bit of an entrepreneur. In the mind of an entrepreneur, the word challenge is equal opportunities. It's basically a possibility to contribute with solutions. So all the challenges we're seeing today is our chance to make something better for the world. It's our chance to actually impact the future. So challenges is not necessarily a bad thing if they're handled the right way. When you're talking about securing a solid return, a stable return for investors in Europe and North America, which is our investment base, it's very much about understanding the potential and the risks. And to do that, you need people on the ground. To understand how to build resilient societies, which is in accordance with cultures, which we just heard about, which is in accordance with ambitions and drives and priorities locally, you also need local partnerships. So therefore, it's a very, very big privilege for me to sit here today and actually being equipped with an instrument where I can raise questions to local experts, to people that's working with this every single day and are facing these challenges every single day. And hopefully, this is the beginning of a long road together. So with me, I have both the ISOMOT. So you're going to talk a lot about what kind of risks there's into the system, not only from building growth, but also from the nature itself, how that's going to impact the way that we build infrastructures. We have Matthew coming in, setting up a new fund, meeting a lot of possible challenges and possibilities, and driving very hard to drive that. And then we have Passang, which is coming from Bhutan, which is a totally different mentality used to what I'm coming. I mean, we do have the same kind of mentality, but we don't have it rooted in our system like you have in Bhutan. In Scandinavia, we also value our nature, we value the society values, but we also go far outside those borders which we should go outside sometimes. And then we have Sunil from a commercial bank, driving this in big scale, supporting this in big scale, and actually even creating an infrastructure that is dealing with how to create a sustainable growth. So I'm looking very much forward to this discussion. I would like to have each of you presenting a little bit where you're coming from and how you see this, and then go into a discussion afterwards. So please, Arun.
Thanks, Chris. Great honor to be here. I have difficulty, keeping track of my electricity bill. That's the level of financing I know about. But then I also know that, if you are thinking of investing on energy, especially capital intensive projects, you would like to know what are the risks. And I would like to talk about that. But then it's also important for a responsible investor to know what would be the risk from the investment. I think we are talking about green, energy, and that's where it is, knowing about the risk that would come from the investment, from the project. Now, we heard about HIMAP, Himalayan Monitoring and Assessment Program, which is, I think, one of the most comprehensive study to date, which talks about what are the changing environments, what are the changes in the climate likely to happen in the future. And we have now very good insights into it. Well, we all know that the climate in the Himalayas are changing, the temperature and precipitation, etc. But what is coming up more strongly are the extremes. And we are now understanding more and more, not completely, but better than what we used to, is that the extremes are likely to be changing and are likely to be the most important changes in the future, which will have implications for large infrastructures. The extreme precipitation events, we think, are likely to increase more in the future, resulting in extreme hydrological events, floods. For example, our studies show that it could increase by 100 to 300% in the future. But then also parallel to that, the droughts, the low extremes, we think are likely to increase. And interestingly, both droughts and floods could happen at the same time in two places in the region and could happen in different times in one place of the region. So that is the kind of challenges we are thinking of could happen. And we also know about the cryosphere change, which could lead to, and we have seen evidences of large glacial lakes forming in the headwaters, and outbursts of any of those could lead to catastrophe. We had one experience in 2016, a small lake busted out in Tibet and almost completely destroyed the Vortikoshi Fall. So that is the level of challenges we are looking at. But then I would just quickly add on that it's not just risk to infrastructure, it is also risk from infrastructure, I think. There are many different kinds of changes a large infrastructure could bring. It could drastically change the natural hydrological regime of a river system, which means it could lead to multitude of problems. For example, access to water, the traditional water access could be disrupted. The benefit that could accrue from the projects could have problem of equitable sharing. And also these projects could actually increase the risk if there are certain compromise in the integrity of those large projects. Let me cite the example of 2008, the Koshi embankment outburst. The embankment was supposed to be there to protect people from flood. In contrast, actually, it created a flood. So these are the kind of things which one has to be thoughtful of. But then, understanding the risk actually can help you manage the risk. And these are some of the opportunity, I think, that could rise from detailed, very robust scientific studies. I would limit to this at the moment, Chris.
Matthew, you're working on building this infrastructure. Matthew, you're working on building this infrastructure. And you're seeing enormous potential, but you're also seeing challenges. Share a little bit about first your foundation or your fund, and secondary, what you're seeing there.
Thank you, Christopher. Firstly, allow me to start by thanking everyone for the invitation to be on this panel. It's a real privilege to be sitting with this seasoned group of experts, and of course, a delight to be representing Dolma. As some of you may know, Dolma Foundation has been around for the last 15 years, providing market research as well as funding for children to attend schooling. In around 2014, a sister entity, Dolma Impact Fund, was launched, the country's first international private equity fund, designed to focus on multi-sectors of the Nepalese economy, including renewable energy. And I think one of the first messages that was signaled from the market was the immense demand for power that this country has. Today, I mean, it's no surprise that the government expects or hopes for thousands of megawatts to be built until 2030. And Dolma really is trying to ride that wave of optimism and of opportunity, as Christopher mentioned, to try and open Nepal to the scale of international capital, to bring in institutional capital to places like Nepal, using concessional blended instruments to attract capital into countries like Nepal, which wouldn't otherwise come in because of the risks associated with it. So I'm looking forward to talking a bit about those instruments as the panel goes on. A few things I'd like to just drop into the discussion and perhaps feed the dialogue. Dr. Molden earlier was discussing the 2 degrees cap set at the Paris meetings in November of 2015, or 2.5 or 3 degrees required for the Himalayas. The UN estimates that roughly $3.5 trillion will have to be invested into the SDG space to mitigate the cap and to keep it below those temperatures every year. Today, that number comes in at around 1.8 trillion. There's a huge infrastructure gap required, and that needs to be addressed somehow. So it's a real pleasure to be working in this space to understand the attitude, the mandates of the investors willing to come into Nepal. But it's also a two-legged process. In order to sell Nepal and other frontier markets to international markets, there also needs to be some regulatory changes in the architecture that would normally attract that financing. And it'd be fascinating to hear what the other panelists have to say on that. But I'll leave it there, and I look forward to addressing these points further down the line.
Thank you. Passang, you used to be the investment director at the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Bhutan. Investing traditionally is very much about the bottom line. What is the annual return and how can I optimize my returns? In Bhutan, it's a little bit different. You're having a holistic picture. Like you're having the happiness index, everything you're doing is built around creating a holistic picture. How do you merge this and how is that put into investment decisions? What is your experience in actually dealing with these issues on that context?
Thank you, Christopher, for this question as well as the opportunity to sit on this panel. As mentioned, I was heading investments of the Druk Holding and Investment, which is the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Bhutan. Basically, the fund, Sovereign Wealth Fund owns all the hydropowers in Bhutan and all the hydropower except for one PPP, where it's 74% owned by the government. Everything is owned by the state in Bhutan. So that's what I've been doing last 10 years, and just recently I've moved out from there. But going back to the question of how do we merge commercial as well as the other parameters that today I think is no longer something new that we are talking about when you talk about besides the whether it's triple bottom line or happiness index. I think just happiness was mentioned I think twice earlier in the inaugural session as well as the first panel. So I think it's now I can safely say it's nothing new. How we used to look at investment is that first of all I think any investment we totally separate the commercial as well as the social investment. So we feel that the role of social investments where like for example roads or other infrastructure is best left to the government. And as the government's holding company, our responsibility was to ensure that we have a return that can fit into those kind of initiatives. So that's the first difference that we used to draw. But having said that, I think when you look at commercial returns, that cannot be looked at in isolation. And I think again, going back to what we call the 4 pillars of GNH, which was mentioned earlier as well, then the cultural aspect comes in, environment definitely, especially when you talk about large-scale projects, and good governance. So we look at those things, and it's a very, I mean, in Bhutan today, it's a matter of a principle that has been put in the system that it's no longer surprising that you would say, oh, okay, but this is a good project, but environmentally it's not good, or culturally it's not insensitive. And I can quote a few examples of projects that were just dropped because we thought that it was not culturally sensitive or because we thought the environmental impact didn't justify such projects. So it is almost like your own conscience that you look at the projects and see whether you would do it if it was your own, if you are the one impacted by those projects. So that's how we look at it. Maybe I'll leave at this and thank you.
Thank you very much. Sunil, coming into the commercial side, I'm coming from a commercial bank as well. I mean, you have been looking at, there's going to be invested tens of billions of dollars into water energy or renewable energy in the next 20, 30 years in Nepal. And inside NMB, you have been creating departments for renewable energy and as well as for water energy. So what are you seeing and how do you position yourself for these alternatives and what are the challenges you are seeing and what needs to be done to kind of deal with those?
Thank you, Christopher, and good morning to you all. It's my great pleasure to be here today. And first of all, let me take a few minutes of yours to introduce my bank, NMB. We've been in operation for more than 20 years in Nepal, and we are one of the banks. We're the only bank in Nepal who practice this value-based banking in Nepal. We are a part of this global alliance for banking and values. So our approach is like triple bottom line. So people, planet, and prosperity is our, that's the model we are following in our business model. And that's why we have, as you said, we have a separate unit for renewable energy and energy sector. And we are part of this Dutch DFI FMO. We are joint venture partner with them as well. So our major focus here in Nepal is to focus on real economy, and for that, our focus is on energy sector. So right now we have about more than 30 projects, hydropower projects we are financing as a lead and a member of syndicates. And we already have financed more than 17 micro-hydro projects in the rural areas. And likewise, in the urban solar, when we had this acute power shortages some couple of years back, we financed more than 200 this urban solar projects like household solar with the partnership with AEPC, that's the government body. So overall, what we are seeing here is this is the sector where, because as you know, if you look at the whole structure of the macroeconomics, there's a huge trade deficit in the country as of now. And there's no, it's increasing over the last 2-3 years. And because of that trade deficit, we are facing a lot of problems in the commercial banking space as well. So for that, ultimately what we should do here is, if you focus more on energy sector, that will create a lot of, within that ecosystem, that will create a lot of business opportunity going forward for us. Like if there's a sufficient power supply within the country next 3-4 years, that will bring in a lot of FDIs into the country, that will bring in a lot of new industries into the country, and like hotels, everything will be there. So that will create the SMEs, micro SMEs, which is one of the major focus area for financing us going forward. So that's where we are looking at. That's why despite all the challenges, we are, if you look at our portfolio, let's say it's 1% of our total risk asset is in renewable energy other than hydropower. If you look at hydropower, combined hydropower and other renewable energy, there's about 7-8% of our total assets is in this sector. And if you look at our exposure, then it's almost 15%. What we plan in next 5 years, 2022, is at least we'll have a 20% of our total risk assets in the hydropower and other renewable energy like solar, biogas and all these.
How many percent?
20%, that's what we are planning. That's what is our plan, that's what is we agreed with the FMO for that. So right now, 7-8%. Exposure-wise, our commitment is about almost 13-14%, so 20% in next 5 years. So that means a lot of investments going there. So why we're doing that is, basically, that will create a very conducive environment that will support the entire real economy going forward, and that will create, there are a lot of cement industries coming, there are a lot of hotels are coming, there are a lot of things which require power, and ultimately, if we partner with this IPPs, then probably that will ultimately help the entire ecosystem to build, and we'll be part of that. Entire this pie will increase. That's what we are focusing. So if you look at the renewable energy space especially, the problem what we have seen is today, most of these renewable energy projects are being promoted, are being done through the subsidy. So because of that, what we've seen is it's not giving kind of a bankable risk for the banks, which, we are in the commercial banking space. So probably we need to come up with new kind of instruments going forward, new, some level of risk taking, we have to look at from the risk appetite perspective, we have to look at from the different angle. And most of the projects which are currently being run by the government and other agencies are just to provide access to energy to the rural areas. But they are not seeing these things from the commercial or from the risk perspective, which is bankable to the other players here. So probably that's the challenge we are facing, and we're working that in different products in different areas. So hopefully, I mean, we can have a different model going forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Arun, you talked a little bit about risk from a different perspective. I'm sitting in Stockholm. We're raising $500 million. We're going to invest a lot in this region. Everything is going to be reinvested in this region, and some of it in Nepal as well. Looking into this scenario of risk from infrastructures and risk to infrastructures, and primarily in renewable energy and water infrastructure, what would your recommendations be to me for due diligence? Where should I look and what should I think about?
Well, I think definitely what I'm talking about is not to scare the investors, but to make them aware what could be the scenario, so that in the long run it is properly planned and there are measures to minimize the risk. Let me give an example of water availability, right? We do not think the water availability will change much in the future, but what we think there will be interannual and intra-annual variability increasing. So that would mean a bit of problem for hydropower, let's say, or any water resource-based infrastructure. So having understanding of that actually helps to plan the infrastructure in a way that takes into account those variabilities. If it is a flood, perhaps the floodgates can be designed in such a way that it can actually release the flood safely. Or there are ways to store water which can actually, manage that ups and downs properly. So I think that would be my suggestions or my indications to any potential investor, to be mindful of what are the possible changes and probably, convert those challenges into opportunities. I think there are also opportunities. We find that due to enhanced melting and also increased monsoonal precipitation, the system could have, in finite time period, more water than it used to have previously. So how can we use that? Can we use that as a positive change? I think these needs to be investigated, and I think that is something which I would indicate as a need for investors.
Thank you. Matthew, a relatively new fund, going out funding renewables, equity, risks, working with entrepreneurs, can't be easy all the time. What is the challenges? And how do you deal with them?
Christopher, I mean, I think there's obviously a lot of challenges, but the challenges are equally balanced out with the opportunity. Needless to say, the potential that the region has. The problem isn't necessarily identifying the challenges or the opportunity. It's actually finding the bridges that will connect the two. Through our work over the last year, we're fortunate to have excellent partners through DFID that are providing us financing to actually understand what the institutional investor appetite is for countries like Nepal. And generally speaking, one thing that we were surprised with is the gap that exists between the DFI, multilateral development bank ecosystem and the commercial institutional ecosystem. The products that are available for DFIs through currency hedging, guarantees on junior debt, etc., are simply not in the visibility or in the driving seat for institutional investors. They're not aware of those opportunities that can potentially drive them into institutions and countries like Nepal. So I think in terms of bridging the challenges and the opportunities, it's to highlight what's already out there and actually pushing the message for blended finance. Blended finance is a fascinating new concept which is emerging. Not many people know about it. It's basically the crowding in of institutional or private commercial capital using public or philanthropic funds. So in other words, providing first loss reserves or providing cheaper debt to convince private developers to invest in projects which otherwise would not be commercially interesting for them. And suddenly it can be through these mechanisms. And I think at the moment the mobilization ratios, so for every dollar that the multilateral development banks invest in these developing markets, it only attracts another dollar of private institutional capital. At the moment, there's a movement trying to push those mobilization ratios to 2 to 1 or even 4 to 1. And I think that is the next step for making countries like Nepal and other frontier markets more attractive to these institutions.
And I think it's worth mentioning. I mean, it's never easy to be the first one taking a new route. To be the first one walking on the path is not easy. But if you're looking at IFC estimations, we're talking about, I think, 30 or 40 billion dollars that need to be invested in infrastructure over the next 15 to 20 years in Nepal. And that means that the path you're taking is going to be followed up by a lot of other people. So I think there's a huge potential, but there's work to be done.
Yeah, no, I think so. And I think one other point worth bringing up off the back of Mr. Casey's point on the subsidies, the fossil fuel industry in terms of volume actually has 3 times the size of the renewables subsidies, globally speaking. There's a lot of hype about renewable subsidies. And I think for nascent technologies in batteries and such, of course there is a place for those. But Nepal has a mature hydro sector. The solar sector is maturing as well. Prices are coming down. It's becoming cost effective. I think what would draw institutional investors into markets like Nepal as well is a reasonable response as well from the government regulations, making tariffs actually reasonable. In order to attract that investment. Right now, the structure in place won't be attracting any solar investments for some time, particularly from outside of Nepal. So those are just some points I wanted to make.
Passang, in Bhutan, you're dealing around the sectors: transport, housing, green cars. You're also trying to deal with waste, and you told me an interesting story about how you use your plastic this morning. So you don't really have waste enough to do waste to energy yet, but you're using other sources. Can you share a little bit kind of how you create an ecosystem around your consumption?
Right. I think one of the things that many people forget about Bhutan, and especially when you look at numbers, is how small Bhutan is, and especially the population. We are about 700,000 people. So when you talk about waste, it looks quite a lot, but the moment you put a number to it, it's too small to do many things. But now people are finding, I think globally, I think people realize that waste is money. I think Bhutan's no different, and there's a lot of competition for the waste now. So we had a private firm called Greener Waste that started waste collection and segregation, and now people have come up with green roads where they're putting the plastics in roads. And then people are now finding different ways to use papers, especially plastics, I think, which is one of the worst ways that we could think of finding a lot of use in Bhutan. So I think, and that goes again with the government policy of trying to encourage such new projects where all this waste don't go to a landfill, rather it's usefully employed somewhere here. So.
Thank you. Sunil, we're about to raise this fund, and we're going to do more. SEB, the bank I'm working for, we are managing 800 million in microfinance. We're just doing another fund, another 200 million, meaning that we are top 4, top 5 in the world in microfinance. Now we're doing this Himalayan fund, which I hope and have the ambition to raise 500 million in the first step. Seen from your point of view, we are going to be dependent on collaborations with institutions like NMB. We don't know risks here. We don't know how to distribute. We don't have an ambition of doing that, meaning that we'll be totally dependent on partnerships. In your world, what would a dream partner, raising capital in Europe and raising capital in the US, what would a dream partner look like? What kind of capital do you need? What do you need from international investors? How should we tailor this in a way that it fit your purposes? Is it parallel investments? Is it lending to you, to unlending? Is it equity? What is the kind of features you need?
When you look about the support in that case, like it could become some sort of hybrid kind of model, not exactly like equity or sort of direct subsidy. But what we are looking at is, first of all, I mean, the hazing would be one of the major issue here. But when we talk about financing the local projects, having cash flow at the rupee, then that's one of the major issues we are facing, even for financing, because we're looking at fund for hydropower financing here, because right now we're facing liquidity issues. The major issue, the cost part, is something to do with that hedging, because we're not getting locally, it's not possible for us to hedge the dollar foreign currency versus rupee. So that's one of the cost component which makes it not feasible for getting funding, especially for hydropower, where there is, as you mentioned earlier, like the PPA is something at fixed at the purchase price is fixed at one rate, tariff is fixed at one rate, and because of that, they don't have any appetite for going their interest rate component beyond certain level. So that part needs to be settled. I mean, we are discussing with the central bank also for that. Apart from that, I mean, there are a lot of projects where we can, especially in other smaller renewable energy side, like when you talk about solar power, we've discussed about that. Based on the NEA's, the PPA model, I mean, we need some sort of their viability financing there, because the kind of pricing they're quoting is not feasible for any developers to come up with the projects in solar segment also. So probably that's one area, to start with, that can be done. But in other areas, like what we're working is like trade guarantee funds, where some of the risk is taken by the guarantee fund, and we're taking, that's help us to increase our risk appetite, and that taking that to the next level and leveraging on whatever is available there. So that's one, because whatever we've done in the last 17, this micro hydro project is done with the trade guarantee fund from the different GFIs. So that helps us to take more, as I said, mentioned earlier, our non-performing asset in that renewable energy segment is about 13%, which is quite high if you look at. But if we get that kind of support, that'll increase our some level of risk appetite and take the leverage on whatever we get it. So it's a kind of, I mean, different models, different kind of products we can use going forward. The other area where we can think of is like government of Nepal is sitting on the carbon credit fund. And because of this biogas project which you finance, I mean, they're getting that fund, and that fund's not being utilized. And if you can get, I mean, that can be tied up with as a repayment of our loans for biogas projects, then that can be probably help us to take more projects and further get further credits on that, and that can be used for viable business model for us to operate. I mean, I think.
Thank you. Passang, I was interested a little bit. Bhutan is the only country in the world which is actually having a positive carbon account. So due to the forestry, you're actually capturing 3 times as much CO2 as you produce. You also have a lot of hydro energy. 3,000 megawatt, I think.
1,500 generating and 3,000 under construction.
2,000 under construction.
Yeah.
But with another 7,000 to come.
Yeah.
Meaning that you're going to be a massive exporter of energy. You, a couple of years ago, did the first PPP ever with Tata Energy, Tata Group in India. And I'm a little curious in respect to this holistic view of creating happiness and including all the social factors, and then creating PPPs with private sector. What is the kind of does it work? What is the kind of is it challenging, or is that a way forward?
I think Bhutan, I think after happiness, if what Bhutan is known for, it might be hydropower. Today, children, small school-going children, even villagers talk about hydropower in Bhutan. So it is a very important part of our Bhutan's development story. And it has, if you look at Bhutan's GDP, actually it's all tied to hydropower. The moment one hydropower comes online, the GDP spikes up, and then again flattens out and that's the nature of hydropower. We cannot have every year power plants coming in. It takes many years to develop. So when you talk about PPP, it does work, I think, and whether it's fortunate or unfortunate in Bhutan, financing has not been a big problem for energy projects, especially, I think, and that goes back to some of the things we are trying to do. Besides creating the financing, I think the enabling environment is equally important. And in Bhutan, because of the will of the government and the acceptance of people, hydropower has been fairly easy to implement. So financing large projects of that scale has not been a big challenge. The government tried a PPP project through the ADB support, and we had one project. Following that, of course, we managed to get a lot of grants to do much bigger projects. So today, the government doesn't feel the need to have private participation in hydropower. But this did trigger off interest from even public sectors to invest in hydropower when they're seeing private people come in. Because I think there was the notion that before the private sector came in, maybe the projects it's all grant-based, so not that viable, and private sector might not be interested in such a project. But when we demonstrated with one PPP, people see that okay, it's actually not bad to invest in that model. So going forward, I think right now Bhutan is fully. We are lucky that way that we don't have a financing issue, but the challenges are after financing and construction. What next? Now, how do you use the power? What are the challenges we feel? And that's where even I think for Nepal and Bangladesh and Bhutan, I think the cross-border trading of energy is becoming an important issue right now. Some of the things that maybe right now Nepal probably in the near future, because of the demand in country, you won't face such an issue because you import anyway. But going forward, I think with so much hydropower potential in the future, how do we regionally share power? I think that those will be pressing issues in the future. And Bhutan is, because we are so much power surplus, we are facing the issue. Right now, we only export to India, and I think there's ambition to export further. But we have to look at how the cross-border trading plans out. There's been agreement signed, but on the ground, still a lot of work to be done. Right.
Thank you.